Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the theater during the daytime. We are so happy that you're all here today to have our Beyond the Podium speaker come and talk to you about Copenhagen. I just wanted to let you know our Beyond the Podium series is part of our enrichment program here on board. That is our main event or activity, part of our Celebrity Life activities. It's very important to us and our guests absolutely adore it. So we really hope that you enjoy our two Beyond the Podium speakers this cruise. We have Michelle Monroe, who will be speaking about the legend Matt Monroe, her father, who is a famous producer and singer. She will be having her talks in Celebrity Central, which will be right outside the main theater in the smaller theater. And that will be always in the afternoon around 2 p.m. But just check the daily. And then we'll always have David Dillard, who I'm going to introduce in just a minute, right here in the theater, the main theater, to speak about our upcoming destinations along our itineraries. So without further ado, let me introduce to you today David Dillard as he speaks to you about Copenhagen, the culture, the architect, and the history. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming today, and thank you Kate for that nice introduction. Just to let you know, on the sea days before we enter a port, I will be speaking on the destination. I'm the destination lecturer for this cruise. And just to give you a little bit of background information on me, the reason that they chose me as your destination lecturer is because of my career and my background as an architect. Part of what I've done in my career is I have been a historic architect, and in the U.S. I'm known as a preservationist. Now, for the English and Europeans in the audience, you would refer to me as a conservationist. It means exactly the same thing, just different terminology. But primarily what I've done, I've spent 35 years restoring historic buildings, doing expert analysis of structures, their condition, damage, and so forth, if whatever it's called upon. And I've also assisted some archaeological digs in reconstructing archaeological sites using computer modeling. But I'm originally from New Orleans, Louisiana, which if you detect a southern accent, that's because I'm from the deep south, even further south than the deep south. Actually, New Orleans is on a peninsula that sticks out into the Gulf of Mexico. So we call anyone north of Hammond, Louisiana, a Yankee. But the interesting thing about what I'm doing for this cruise is giving you the overview, the picture of what you will see when you go to the destinations. Now, if you were in the previous presentation, Karen was telling you about the shore excursions, and I can't stress enough how good those are. I've taken a couple of them, and they get you into places efficiently without having to wait in line. They take you and show you some things that you may not normally see. And so they're well worth the money you pay to have a private bus with your own bus waiting outside of the destination that you're going to see. And the tour guides are excellent. So I just want to give them a plug. And Karen is the person to talk to about that, or anyone at the shore excursions desk. My job is to tell you more about Denmark, the history, the architecture, and the culture. So let's just start with where we are in the world here. And I try to give people a picture because I know as a traveler, and by the way, one thing I didn't mention, I do live in Europe even though I'm an American. I live in southern Spain, and it takes you, I guess for me, and I'm pretty well traveled, about a year to get a feeling for the distances in Europe and where things are. But Denmark is an old Norse country, and I use the term Norse rather than Viking, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. But you can pronounce it Copenhagen or Copenhagen if you're a Westerner. Danish pronunciations of words, I'll warn you, are extremely difficult. The Danish language, everybody that you meet, if they are Danish, they're going to speak English. And the reason is because the Danish language only makes sense to Danish people, so it's virtually useless outside of Denmark. They can converse with other Norse countries like Sweden and Norway, but that goes back to the days of the what we normally know as the Viking era, and this distinct language developed over a long period of time, and it's not based on Latin as most of the Romantic languages like Italian, French, Spanish, those and English are all based on the Latin. So you have completely different pronunciations, completely different words. So what you see on your screen is one of the postcard views of, I call it Copenhagen, okay, so just forgive me for that, but I have two Danish friends and that's the way they say it, so I just have become used to hearing that pronunciation, but you can call it Copenhagen. But in the 10th century, when the Norsemen who were roaming around in their wooden ships were exploring, settling, and as some of you know, raiding and pillaging, which I'm going to try to expound on that a little bit. You may not think of it as raiding and pillaging after my talk, but when the Norsemen were operating around this area, this was a fishing village in the 10th century, and it developed from that until about the 15th century into the capital of Denmark. Now I want to show you just basically where we are, and this is what I was talking about. Okay, so you come from America and you come to Europe, and the relative distances of things seem abnormal. For one thing, Spain, which is the Iberian Peninsula down here, is a huge country, and Portugal is over here to the western edge of it. But I've had friends come and they call and they say, well, we're going to be in Valencia, why don't you drive up, we're coming on a cruise ship, and see us. And they look at these maps and they think, well, you know, Europe is a bunch of small countries. And I said, well, I would love to see you, but I don't feel like driving 10 hours and spending the night and then coming back, because Valencia is 10 hours from what is known as the Costa del Sol, where I live. And so this is a lot more distance here in Spain than you think. It's also quite a bit of distance from where we started, which is here in Southampton, to St. Petersburg, which is here. And you'll see how long it takes to get there. That's why we're on a 14-day cruise. But we began in the English Channel, and the boat, the ship, excuse me, this is not a boat, it's a ship, you may have noticed was rock solid in the English Channel. Well, when we went to Bruges, we were in Northern Europe, and in Northern Europe, where Zeebrugge, which is the port area, is, you're just at the brink between the North Sea and the English Channel, so these two bodies of water meet. After you leave Belgium and you go in toward Copenhagen, the only way to get there is to go through this L-shaped body of water here, which means you have to cut diagonally through the North Sea. So sometimes it can be a little bit rough. I would like to reassure you that there's no danger or anything. The ship is totally safe, but you might notice some movement, and that's because the North Sea is notoriously rough, and it has a lot of large waves and wind. But once we get into this L-shaped body of water, we will come down to Copenhagen. So we were in Bruges, next stop will be there, and as we progress through these lectures, I'll have this same map with all of the other destinations. Now, one thing I want to point out, you signed up for a Baltic cruise, okay? But you're not in the Baltic Sea. You are still outside of the Baltic Sea. You're in the North Sea. And then this body of water has a strange name, which I don't know right off. You go through Copenhagen, and after that, you'll enter into the Baltic Sea. And the Baltic states are here. That would be Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. Those are the Baltic states. And then Russia is at the tip end of the Gulf of Finland here. And Russia takes up a huge amount of land. It is gigantic. But this is Denmark. It sticks up like a finger. It's a peninsula off the mainland of Northern Europe. So let's talk a little bit about the history quickly. I want to show you some key things. This is Absalon, and Absalon was a clergyman/statesman. Clergyman/statesman. He was known as the Bishop of Roskilde, and he was a 12th century founder of the city of Copenhagen, and probably the foremost politician of his time. He had a castle, and he came right at the very end of the Norse domination of the not only North Sea, Scandinavia, but the Baltic states as well. So he was sort of that crossover. Then along came the Hanseatic League, and if you look at this slide that I have next, you'll see the ruins of Absalon's castle. So it existed for about 300 years, and then it was destroyed by the Hanseatic League. And just a word about that, and I'm going to have to mention the Hanseatic League more than once, because they were such a dominant force and within the Baltic states, within this area. And primarily what their origin was in Germany. They were based in Lübeck, Germany, and they were a group of German merchants primarily. And they established a network of trade. They had their own ships, they had their own army, and they had different contracts that they would use to transact trade among all of these different countries along the way. Now, basically at that time, you had city-states, and so the Hanseatic League would go into a city such as Bruges, which was a Hanseatic city, and say, okay, well, you're creating things like lace, which is one thing that Belgium is famous for. You also have woolens and other kinds of goods that we can trade with the people in Norway, for instance. And if you go to Bergen, Norway, you'll see the Hanseatic League Museum. So if you're ever on a cruise to Norway and you end up in Bergen, I would really advise you to go see that, because this is a truly fascinating group of people that operated for 200 years in the 14th century and 15th century, and a lot of people haven't heard of them before, but the Hanseatic League was extremely powerful, and the cities that became a member of the Hanseatic League network flourished and became very wealthy. And so you have cities like Bruges, which you can tell that had very fine buildings, architecture. They were Hanseatic League cities, and Tallinn, Estonia was one as well. But we'll talk about those a little bit more later. So anyway, the Hanseatic League didn't like Absalon because he was old school, he wasn't getting with the program, and they were pretty much the Amazon of their day. They were the ones who were delivering goods throughout this area, and Absalon was not really playing their game, and so they destroyed his castle. You can go under Christiansborg Castle, which I'll show you in a minute too. Fabulous place, and you can see the ruins of it. Now, we're going to get to one of the key players in Danish history, especially here in Copenhagen. This is Christian IV, and this is a portrait that was painted by Pieter Isaacs in 1612, but the lifespan of Christian IV was 1577 to 1648. Now, since Absalon, which you have to remember, 12th century, going to Christian IV, which we're looking at basically the 17th century, there were a lineage, a long lineage of Danish kings, and you go back to Valdemar the First, Valdemar the Second, those were the first of the Danish kings. And then throughout that period, which was about 400 years or so, you had a succession. And the one that really developed the city of Copenhagen was this man. And you can see from the crown over here, and his warrior helmet, and the way he's dressed, that he was not only extremely wealthy and powerful, because Denmark, during this period, especially the 16th century, was a powerhouse, an economic powerhouse as well as a military powerhouse. And Christian IV, now there's a saying that I've heard before, and it's kind of a funny thing. I have a close friend who's from Copenhagen, and they say, oh, the Danish are the happiest people in the world. Well, I asked him about that one day, and he said, they don't know what they're talking about. A typical reaction from a guy like him. But anyway, the thing is that they are noted as being happy people, and I think that that came from Christian IV. I've put two and two together because this guy was what we would call in America a party animal. He loved to have fun. He loved to have big parties. He loved to drink. He liked to invite all of his friends down to Rosenborg Castle, where he lived, where he had lots of hunting grounds. And he was a man's man. He liked to fight in the battles that Denmark was having. And so he really developed what I think is this attitude that Danish people are fun-loving and happy. Now, when he was born, his father, Frederick, was in Frederick II in a smaller castle, which was also very nice. And I've often wondered how they made the decision to go from what would be considered a mansion to what would be considered a pretty good-sized office building, even by world standards. This is the Frederiksborg Castle. And as you can see, it's not in Copenhagen, it's in Dillard. But this is where Christian IV was born, and it's just an absolutely huge structure. And I was thinking about the fact that given that it has something like 1,400 rooms, I believe, if the young children were roaming around the house and decided to go exploring, it might take a while to find them because the building is so huge. It's just immense. And it's also part of the what we call the low country method of construction. Now, all of the cities that are in this part of Northern Europe are called low countries. And the reason is they're virtually flat and they don't have mountains, so there's no hard stone, which you find in mountains, to build stone constructed buildings. And so they use brick. And you'll notice that brick, which is made of clay, is quite abundant here in this building. They also like to use these highly decorated ornamental roofs. And so Frederiksborg Castle is a result of that. Now, to quickly sum up what happened to Christian IV, as I said, he was a man's man, and he liked to go to the battlefield. And this is a painting that's hanging where he's buried in a tomb in Rosenborg Cathedral. And as you can see, he's just come back from a battle. It was called the Battle of Kohlberger. And you can see that he is bandaged up. He's been wounded, yet he's still proudly holding his sword. One of his noblemen over here with his arm in a sling, he still has his sword. And here he is getting off the ship after a victory. And this is the kind of thing he liked to do. So he was a very popular king, and he was also instrumental in forming the city of Copenhagen. And if you notice in his burial chamber here, which is in the Roskilde cathedral, you can see that same painting, and here is his statue, and I think this is his coffin, I believe, and he's flanked by all of his family members. But, you know, artists have a way of sending a message in a sort of subtle way. And I wonder if perhaps this painting of him bandaged up after a battle, the artist may have been indicating, now you know why he's here in a tomb, because he was really sort of a rough and rowdy John Wayne type king. So anyway, let's just continue on and look at the city itself. Now, I found this map, and I happen to really like maps, so this is an 1800s map of the city. And what you notice are these ramparts. Now, ramparts are a defensible wall, and you'll see them in a lot of cities. In Tallinn, Estonia is probably the best place on this trip where you'll see them. But the ramparts were built to keep bad people out. And one of the reasons was that it was a Hanseatic League city, and they had lots of valuable goods within Copenhagen. And so they wanted to protect them. Another feature is this pentagram shape in the plan, which is known as the castellet, or the citadel. And that's important too, and I'll show you why. You'll probably see that, but you may not realize you're seeing it, because if you look at modern day Copenhagen, you'll notice that the rampart has been taken down and there's a waterway, and this is a recreational area. You'll see here that the ramparts for the citadel have been taken down, and it is also used as a recreational park area. A lot of joggers go there, a lot of people go there for picnics and things. But I'm going to point out some of the main places where you'll want to go, and I've numbered them. Okay, this is Nyhaven or Nyhaven, depending on how you want to pronounce it. The Danish pronounce it probably differently than any of us would ever think of. But this is the little canal here that was dug by some Swedish prisoners that Christian IV captured. Yeah, he was always at war with somebody, and he was having this continual battle for territory with the Swedish. So he brought back these Swedish prisoners, and the fishermen would come in along the river, which is the Sidhavnen River, and he wanted them to have a place to sell fish and to park their boats. So he gets the Swedish prisoners out there and says, okay, dig me a canal and we'll make it into a nice tourist attraction, so that when people come on cruise ships in 2018, they'll love to go there and visit. So this, you'll see, this is the first slide that I showed with the typical Copenhagen view. Okay, we go quickly over here to number 2, the citadel, the castellet, as the Danish call it. Then number 3, this is a beautiful place, and I highly recommend getting out and walking. Usually, if you're on one of the tours that the ship provides, you will find that they will go drive by it. But you know, London has the changing of the guard. Other cities have the changing of the guard. But one of the places where you can see the changing of the guard very well is at Amalienborg Palace. And the reason is because it's not blocked off like so many things in London. You can't go down number 10 Downing Street or anything anymore. The changing of the guard, you have thousands of people show up for, and Buckingham Palace is not on a street where a bus can stop. So you have to go, you know, walking. But Amalienborg is very accessible, and that was the home of the royalty. It still is. Christiansborg Palace is number 4 over here, and this is one of the most extravagant displays of Danish wealth in the city. And they have just wonderful art and a lot of artifacts and things that have been collected by these kings who've been in Denmark for years, hundreds of years, and there's some extraordinary things there. It's just really a beautiful place. So that is one tour that you might want to see. And then finally, down here in the southern part of the main old city is what is known as Rosenborg Castle. And the notable thing about Rosenborg, or Rosenborg, is that that was where Christian IV lived. And because of that, he being the fun-loving guy that he was, he wanted a lot of land around, and he has outdoor events, big parties. He would invite a lot of nobility and people like that to come to his home in Rosenborg. So I'm going to give you some quick overviews of what this stuff looks like. Now, this is Niehaven or Niehoven. There are wooden ships parked along it. These are old antique boats. There's usually a musical event or something going on here. And then these are the buildings that you see in all of the postcards, okay? So, beautiful area to go walk around, lots of shops and mostly restaurants along here. And I apologize for the fact that this is under construction, but the last time I was in Copenhagen, it was under construction. I don't know what the delay is, but the King's New Square, when it is finished, is a beautiful park. And one of Copenhagen's most famous hotels is here. It's a great place where you can sit and look out at the park, but this is a little bit of an older photograph, so I'm not sure what condition this is in now. Over here is a beautiful building that you'll probably see as you're on a tour or in a bus, is the Royal Danish Theatre. And so this is the area around the Copenhagen Canal. And one of the things that I need to tell you, especially ladies that like to shop, is that the Storgate, which is the notorious Copenhagen shopping street where every major retailer in the world is represented, if you go straight down this street and keep going, maybe you can take this one or this one, but there's two streets that connect into it, and it goes all the way down to Tivoli Gardens, and it's nothing but shops, and it's a pedestrian street. So if you're in the mood to buy diamonds, whatever your husband wants you to put on his credit card, that's the place to go. It's sort of the Rodeo Drive of Copenhagen. Okay, so looking at the Amalienborg Palace, you'll notice, and I don't want you to be disappointed when you see this, but being a preservationist, conservationist, as an architect, I can understand why. They have so many historic buildings that a lot of times you'll go to see something in Europe, and you may even have made a special vacation to see it, and you get there and it's wrapped in plastic. And one of the reasons is because there's a continual amount of restoration going on in order to keep these buildings up to standards. Otherwise they would simply decay and start leaking water. Many of them have priceless paintings and antiques and things in them. So this is an ongoing thing in Europe. But from this photograph, you can see the square, which is really an octagon, made up by these four main buildings, 1, 2, 3, 4. These are the palace buildings of Amalienborg. But look at the church here, and you'll notice that Frederick's Church is right on axis coming through the gardens. They have the changing of the guard here once a day, I think at noon. Then they have this beautiful formal garden out here on the waterfront. And this is a wonderful place to go. The Frederick's Church was designed to look like St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And if you notice, the roof is the same. It's done in the same style that Michelangelo loved, which was called Rococo. A lot of what you see in these European cities is what's known as neoclassical architecture. And there's various different types of that, which I'll try to point out when we get to something that is truly unique. Now, Christiansborg Palace is huge, but it is definitely worth going to. And as you go in through these buildings, you'll be led into the different chambers and so forth that the royal family used. And the throne room, which is totally incredible. There are just wonderful works of art in there. And the Danish kings, as I said, were extremely wealthy, so they could afford the best of everything. And many times they would import artisans from either France or Italy, because those were the ones that during the Renaissance times were really producing the good stuff. And so you'll see like amazing murals on the wall and amazing decorative flooring and amazing plasterwork and gold leaf things and the ceilings and stuff. But it's a beautiful palace. Now the present building is not as old as you might think. There's been a palace here for a long time, but this particular version of it was only finished in 1928, so it's more of a modern place where a lot of governmental things go on, but it's well worth going to. And so I want to point out something about the Castellet. Now you can't really see when you go here. You'll be probably on this walkway or coming in this direction. You can also go down here. The buses usually park in this area, and what happens is everybody comes here for one reason, and I'm going to get to the story behind the story, but this was the old citadel, and it was one of the first places developed in Copenhagen as a fortification, all right? And as I said, it was because of the fact that you had warring factions within Europe all during the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. Well, they don't need that anymore. They have the EU now in Brussels, so they don't fight with each other. And all of the fortifications and stuff were taken down many years ago when they became irrelevant. And so you have what is now a park, and it still has this pentagram shape. Now, you won't probably go into this area, but there is one thing that I'll tell you that most people see when they come to Copenhagen. The Little Mermaid statue. And the Little Mermaid is right here. You can't see it because it's small. It's not like a big statue. It's not the Statue of Liberty or something like that. It's a very small statue sitting on a rock, and it represents the character from the story, The Little Sea Maid, which it was called originally, or The Little Mermaid, by Hans Christian Andersen, who was a famous Copenhagen resident. Now, there's another thing I just want to tell you about, because most people miss it when they go here. They run out and they all want to take a picture or a selfie in front of the Little Mermaid. But if you go quickly and take your picture there, and before the bus knows you're gone, quickly walk down and go to this spot, and that is the Gaffian Fountain, which is a really unusual fountain. It's a mythical character with these, I think it's 3 or 4 large bulls that he's riding, and the water is cascading down. And it's an unusual fountain, and one that makes great pictures. And so while everybody's getting their pictures at the Little Mermaid, which you almost have to wait in line for this time of year, you can scoot down and get a good shot of that. So don't miss it. Okay, so we want to talk about another favorite place in Copenhagen, and this is the predecessor to Disneyland in California. And it's been said that Walt Disney was probably on a trip to Europe and discovered Tivoli Gardens. Now, Tivoli Gardens is not the oldest theme park in the world, it's the second oldest theme park in the world. The oldest one is in London, and it's called Vauxhall. But Tivoli was modeled somewhat like that, and it has a lot of rides. One of the charming things about Tivoli is that it is very, very 19th century in the way things look and feel. You don't have the sort of Six Flags Over Texas feel where everything's huge and, you know, just the gigantic scale and enormity of it. Tivoli Gardens is rather small, and people have been coming here since 1843. So many of the original rides and things that you see are still intact and well maintained, and it's a fun place to go. And it has a variety of things, like there's bandstands and things like that where you can go and hear music events, but there's also grass areas where you could just go sit. There's some restaurants, there's some kind of hidden little gardens that are associated with it. But the fun stuff at Tivoli, as far as rides go, all happen mainly in this corner. Now, I'll give you a tip. This is the NIMB Hotel. That's spelled N-I-M-B. And many celebrities, when they come to Denmark and stay in Copenhagen, this is their choice of hotel. So there's been numerous rock stars, movie stars, people that you would know from the media who have stayed at this hotel. And you can go up on the porch and have a coffee or lunch or whatever you like. One of the things, if you do that, you'll notice that Denmark is notoriously expensive for common items like that. I mean, just eating is expensive here. So be careful and make sure you study the menu carefully before you order at any restaurant. Now, when you go to Tivoli or anywhere in Copenhagen, you'll notice that they eat hot dogs quite a lot, and they're bright red, which may strike you as funny, but they love hot dogs, and this particular Danish hot dog is one of the favorite foods. Another thing that you'll see, and I do encourage you to try it, but it's kind of like, I would relate it to sushi in Japan, is the s'mores board, which is an open-faced sandwich. And a s'mores board is can have any variety of ingredients, anything from pickled herring to ham, or a variety of cheeses, vegetarian stuff, whatever you like. But s'mores board is a favorite food here as well. So I want to just quickly go through and talk about a couple of cultural issues, because I've kind of given you the overview of the city, all right? Those are most of the places that you'll see. But I want to talk about the culture of Denmark and of Copenhagen, because there are a couple of things that I think are notable. Now, number one is that back in the 1960s in America, I remember when you open Life magazine or one of the older magazines, and you'd see like a new house, it would have this weird-looking furniture. And to us who are children of the 50s and 60s, this was a revelation. Our parents didn't own anything like that. And I can remember my mother talking about Danish modern furniture and how one of the neighbors had done her house in Danish modern and how unusual that was. Well, Danish modern obviously came from Denmark because of the name. And one of the key individuals in it was Arne Jacobsen. He and his wife were designers, and it was back during the 40s, 50s, and 60s when these designers began to theorize that we no longer needed decoration. We didn't need ornament on our furnishings, our utensils that we use for eating, our light fixtures, and even buildings. And so you had, in effect, what was a cleaner version of furniture that was based on natural or organic forms. So if you look at some of Arne's designs, you see this building in the background. That's the SAS building, and it had just been built, and they needed furniture. So Jacobsen and his team, which was a number of architects, not just him and his wife, not just he and his wife, began to come up with some ideas on how they might do a new furnishing design, all new to the world. So this is the drop chair, the egg chair, and the swan chair. These are based on, as you can see, forms in nature. And so you had the beginning of what now you see in IKEA. If you go to IKEA, you'll see this clean, stripped down type furniture, very contemporary, and it's become popular all over the world. If you go to Architectural Digest, flip it open, you'll see lofts in New York that cost millions of dollars, and they're all done in this clean type of interior design that was started here in Denmark. So that's what branched off into the modern movement of architecture, which was also influenced by Berlin, Germany, which we'll talk about when we go to Berlin. But the furniture design primarily came from Denmark. Now let me just briefly go to another of the favorite people in the history of Copenhagen, and it's this man, Hans Christian Andersen. This is a famous statue that they have of him, a sculpture in Rosenborg Gardens. Hans Christian Andersen lived from 1805 to 1875. He was most notable for his fairy tales. However, this is a surprising thing. Hans Christian Andersen published 3,381 works of literature, of writing. That is a huge amount of publications. And many of his books were translated in up to 125 different languages. So all over the world you have phrases that we use in our 21st century language, like for instance, the ugly duckling. You might have used that or heard someone say that. Well, that was a fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen. If you hear somebody refer to the Emperor's New Clothes, for instance, that was a fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen. Many of the fairy tales that he wrote had a moral story to them. And when you hear about the stories where children might run off into the woods and get caught by a witch, well, the reason that they were told in that way was that so the young Danish children of the day would not run off into the woods for fear that they might get caught by a witch and baked in an oven or whatever. So he was very much loved in Copenhagen, and he lived in one of the houses in the Copenhagen Canal for 18 years. This is what Hans looked like in real life, and he had this top hat and a rather large nose, and he was easily identifiable by his long coat. And I tend to think that it's a good possibility that the character Willy Wonka may have been modeled after Hans Christian Andersen, because he was sort of unique looking, and as I said, he was well loved. He was a favorite son of the city. So what we also get to, and this is something that I've already talked about, but you're going to see when you go to the Citadel area, this statue, and this is the Little Mermaid. I have seen a first edition fairy tale book by Hans Christian Andersen, and the original story was called The Little Sea Maid. Now the Little Sea Maid, going back to what I said before, had this wonderful life under the sea where all of her family lived, and her father was a king, and she had these beautiful sisters, and they had, instead of birds, they had fish that would fly around their house and so forth, and he describes it as this idyllic place. However, the little sea maid, who was the youngest girl in the family, wanted to see what was above the water. Okay, so this is another situation where a child does something her parents doesn't want, and because of that, she was separated from her family. And so there's that moral connotation again. Well, when you go to the Citadel area, this is what everybody's clamoring to get a picture of, is the statue. It is very small. It's only, I think, about, I don't know, maybe 1.5 meters tall or something. It's really tiny, and it sits on this rock, and you'll find that there will be hundreds of people there, and lots of them will be doing selfies. So try to if you see a big tour group coming, go ahead of them and get your picture quickly, because once the big tour group comes, you won't really be able to see it. Now, I'm going to wrap up quickly here by giving you the straight-out version of something that I think has some, there has been some misunderstanding about what is known as the Viking culture, as Vikings. And you may have watched the series on Netflix, The Vikings. Well, one of the things that I'm going to tell you that is interesting is that the Vikings are not what they call themselves, okay? A Viking is, the word is a verb. In other words, if I was going to clobber you on the head and take your stuff, I would be Viking you, okay? That's a verb. It's like Joe Vikinged Sam last night, you know, it's that kind of thing. What they were actually known as were the Norsemen, and the Norsemen originated in Denmark here. So the Norsemen and Norsewomen, as I've titled this, and there's a reason that I titled it that way, were begun in the region where we are now, in the Denmark area. And as you can see from the dark red, this was the main area of activity, which would have been up into Norway and Sweden. Eventually, they got all the way over to Iceland and even settled on Greenland, okay? So at one time, Greenland wasn't fully covered by ice, and they actually had settlements there that the Norsemen had put there. They traveled quite a bit. They had also made it to the eastern coast of England, and there is evidence of Norse activity in the Black Sea, which, as you can see, is a pretty far distance away from Denmark, but they were able to use smaller rivers because of the lightness and the craftsmanship of their ships, which were rowing ships with a sail, but they mainly were rowed. And Vikings or Norsemen were typically large stature people, and so they had a lot of muscle, and they would build more muscle as they rowed these ships across the North Sea where we are today. And they could do that in horrible weather and rain and snow and freezing cold, and it didn't seem to affect them. They were just so used to the weather up in this part of the world. But there's a different perspective on Norsemen other than the barbarian nature that's portrayed in the media. And I know that they do use the word barbarian, but I don't think they were at all. I think that the German Huns who invaded the Roman Empire were barbarians, but the Norsemen were not. They had a code of ethics, they had their own laws, they had family-oriented communities, and one of the things that they valued the most was the family unit. And so they lived in these long houses that they made from wood, and they always had in each of the clans a chieftain. And the chieftain was the person who could decree whatever needed to be decided upon within the clan. And they had certain laws, like if you were an enemy of a Norse clan and you went to their house, which would be their longhouse, and a lot of people slept in the same house. By the way, there was, if you study their history, they didn't have like individual cottages for each family. They had a communal type arrangement, which was probably good because it was so cold all the time. And they had a big fire in the middle. They had a lot of food that they had gathered. They would go on a plundering excursion to, say, England, and come back with a lot of valuable chalices that they had taken out of churches and things. And they also had food, and they also had slaves, and they had a lot of resources that they had gathered through their plundering activities. But to call them barbarians, I think, is a misnomer, because one of the rules that I was getting ready to tell you is that if you were the enemy of a chieftain and you went to his house, he was required by the Norse code of ethics or laws of the time to invite you in and treat you as a guest, just like you were one of his family. And I guess you had to wait until he left the next day to kill him, which you might very well do, but the thing is that as long as he was in your house, he was considered a friend. And the other aspect to the Norse life is that they weren't always out just traveling by boat or ship. They had settlements, many settlements all throughout the Baltic and Northern European region and Scandinavia. And many of these settlements have grown and become cities, but they were interested in planting, and they were interested in having their settlements be safe from marauders. And if you look at what common media portrays, and this is kind of where I'm going with this, you'll see that the women are portrayed as the stay-at-home moms of the group. By the way, I wanted to show you the weapon of choice of the Norsemen. This is called the Dane axe, and the Dane axe was crafted out of very good quality metal for the age, which a lot of societies had no metal during this time. But these axes were not only used to do utilitarian things, like if they had something like wild game that needed to be prepared, they could use it for that, but it was used for fighting. And as the Norsemen would invade a beachhead or a territory, there have been reported attacks where the defending army said that they could split the shield, a wooden shield, with one single stroke of this Dane axe, split the shield completely in half. And not only that, if you turned around and decided to run, they could toss the axe at you and hit you in the back. And they were experts at throwing the Dane axe as well. So that was the weapon of choice, and the typical soldier in the Norse army, or whatever you want to call it, the Norse group, would have been called a berserker. And one of the reasons they were called that is because they worked themselves up into a frenzy, kind of like an American football team, you know, before they go out on the field. And when they would invade, they were just absolutely unbeatable. They would come in usually at an opportune moment when no one was expecting it, and they would raid and take all your stuff, and if you stood up against them, you got the Dane axe. So they were very good at that, and that was how they accumulated a lot of goods. But one of the things that is interesting is that you had women involved. There were women soldiers as well. So in the case of Leif Erikson, who was notable because there is some evidence that he had traveled all the way to North America by going through the island chains around the Arctic Circle. I don't know how true that story is, but there is this Leif Erikson legend of going to North America. He had a sister, and she was involved in one of these conflicts with either another tribe of Norsemen or some people that they didn't know. I think it was a group out of Iceland or Greenland called the Scalings. And so Leif Erikson's sister is along for the ride with all the guys. And so she hears the commotion, and according to the legend, she comes running out of her tent with no top on, and she grabs her Danish axe and her shield and her helmet and proceeds to slaughter the enemy that was attacking their camp with no top on, which is kind of unusual. But anyway, these lady warriors were called shield maidens. So that was the terminology, and they were as fierce as the men. Now I'm going to quickly go through something here. We have just a few more minutes, so I'm going to quickly go through another story that you may have heard. Now, there's a place in Copenhagen called the Karen Blixen Museum. Karen Blixen was born Karen Dennison, and Karen Dennison's father was an army officer. Karen herself and her family were not considered nobility, but because of her father's position as an army officer, he was often invited to go to the summer homes and to events in the social season of nobility. So Karen was a young woman, in this photograph of her was in 1913, and you notice that in Danish she wrote something about Africa. She had always dreamed of going to Africa. So Karen had been madly in love with a man named Hans Blixen. Hans was a twin brother of this man, and his name, I'll give you his full name because it's amazing when you get into the royals, their names are sort of strange in how long they are, but this is Baron Bror Frederick von Blixen Finnick, okay? And this was the twin brother of Hans. Now she was in love with Hans, not Bror, and they were royalty, and they were also her cousins, even though she was not from a royal family, they were. And because of connections through marriage and so forth, they had title. So she really was madly in love with Hans, and he was a famous equestrian in Denmark, very dashing, good-looking guy, and he said no to her. He wasn't interested in her. So what she ended up doing was marrying his twin brother, which was somewhat of a mistake in retrospect, because the twin brother, Bror, was a notorious womanizer. However, his favorite thing to do was to go to Africa and to be a safari guide and to take other Europeans through the wilds of Africa. So they decided to move to Kenya, and they were going to have a coffee plantation, and then Bror could proceed with his big game expeditions. So this is the Karen Blixen Museum in Kenya, not the one in Copenhagen, all right? So don't get these confused. That's Kenya. We're looking at Africa, not Scandinavia. What happened was that Bror, if you know the story, which you might be already on to what I'm talking about, was the womanizer gave Karen the disease syphilis. And because of that, she had to return to Copenhagen and get the treatment, which was arsenic, very brutal type treatment. And she comes back and she finds that Bror has continued with his lifestyle of hunting and hanging out with women. He eventually divorced her, and he ran off with a blonde that he was in all of the social magazines and things with. And along comes another man into her life who was an Englishman, an aviator, and this was none other than Dennis Finch-Hatton. And if you've seen the movie, you know that Out of Africa, that Karen Blixen was played by Meryl Streep, and Dennis Finch-Hatton was played by Robert Redford. And he began coming to her home in Kenya between safari hunts, and they fell madly in love, and this was the love of her life. Now the tragedy is that he had a famous plane during the day called a Gypsy Moth, which was a very high-performance bi-wing biplane. And before she died, he died, and he crashed his plane. So unfortunately, we no longer have Dennis Finch-Hatton after the plane crash. So she had a tragic life, and you can go learn about it. The movie, I think, is one of the best movies that I've ever seen. But the original book that Karen Blixen wrote was called A Farm in Africa. So it was true, and these are the real characters that were involved. So with that, we're out of time, and I'd like to conclude my presentation. And the next day at sea, you'll hear me again telling about where we're going and what we're going to see. And I hope I've given you a few things that you can talk about at dinner about not only Denmark, but Copenhagen and the Norsemen and Karen Blixen, Hans Christian Andersen, and all of the different things here. So I want to thank all of you for coming today.